Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for people who treasure a good book recommendation. I'm Michaela Andreev, and today I'm bringing you a chat that Annie had with an author who needs no introduction, Kate Grenville. It's coming to you as a minisode because we just wanted to get this chat to you right away. Kate's best known for her book The Secret River, which was published in 2005 to both acclaim and controversy. The story was based on her own pioneer ancestor, Solomon Wiseman, and his experience as a freed convict taking up land on the Hawkesbury River at the expense of the local Indigenous people. Grenville's award-winning book became an analogy for white settlement of Australia, and it was adapted for both stage and television. More than 2 decades on, and following the defeat of the Voice referendum, Kate Grenville has taken another journey back through that same country which her ancestors settled. And the result is her latest book, Unsettled, in which she faces the true history of these landscapes. Annie spoke to Kate about her new book, Unsettled, and began by asking her to explain how it relates to The Secret River.
Yes, The Secret River was my attempt to write about what might have happened on the first day that a sort of representative settler in Australia stood on the land that he decided to take. So it was based on my convict ancestor, a man called Solomon Wiseman, and it tried to explore not to make anybody villains or not to make anybody victims, just to explore the choices that all those people had.
And I think in a way its general popularity was partly that it almost gave white Australia a bit of a way out. They felt a little bit understood by, even though the harshness, the truth was in it. Would that be a fair thing to say?
That's interesting. Look, that hasn't been the response that I've had from anybody. On the contrary, I had a tsunami of mail from readers after that book was published, in which they all said the same thing. We have this hunger to understand the past and to know about it, and your book has made it, given it to us in a very accessible way. Not a history book; it's a novel with fully fledged characters and so on. And so what they really expressed was a desire to understand rather than be kind of given any kind of easy way out. Many people actually said in reading the book that as they got towards the end, they stopped reading because what they could tell was going to happen was, in fact, is what happens in the book, a massacre scene. And they stopped reading because they didn't want to deal with that. That told me a very interesting thing, which is that actually, without consciously knowing it, a lot of us do know what happened, or even back in 2005 when the book came out, people already knew. They knew there was going to be a massacre at the end. But even the fact that they didn't finish the book, I think that's great. They had to confront that darkness, that shadow, even if they weren't prepared to actually walk straight into it.
Now, this book, you say at the beginning you've been circling this book for years, so clearly The Secret River did not get this story out of your system at all. What prompted the decision to actually get in your car and follow the footsteps of your ancestors again through this country?
I suppose the passage of time made me braver. The Secret River isn't the only book I've written about colonial Australia. I've actually written 4 or 5, I suppose, depending on how you count them. And I felt that I was always circling a fact at the heart of my existence as a non-Indigenous Australian, which is that my ancestors were among those early settlers, as we call them, who took the land. And in a way, the fiction was a way of me approaching the subject in a way I could bear, I think, in a way that I could let myself go into it without feeling that I might be destroyed by what I might find. But now, at my grand age, I seem to feel differently. And actually now I want to come out from behind the screen of fiction and say, okay, this is me in this place, a non-Indigenous Australian who wants to find out how to be here in an honourable and honest way without having to pretend that a whole lot of stuff isn't there in the corners.
So your way of doing it was to kind of feel the country. Can you explain the process that you went through, both both the observation but also the writing as you drove northwards.
Yes. When I was researching The Secret River and the other books that I've set in colonial Australia, I did a lot of short trips to a lot of the places where my family had settled over 4 or 5 generations since that first convict ancestor in 1806. And I have a little snippet of family story that my mother passed on for each generation. And so I had already been to most of the places where Unsettled happens. And I had taken copious notes and talked into my phone and, transcribed it and so on. But I had never thought that it would be a book. This was just the exploratory, necessary exploration that I had to do to write the books. But after the referendum was defeated, some iron entered my soul. And I thought, I've got to do something here. I went and voted yes. I handed out leaflets, etc. What can I do now? And what I thought was, what I can do now is make this a very personal bit of truth telling, a very personal bit of hearing the Aboriginal voice that we've just denied, by going to all the places where my family story happens and actually standing on the exact spot, being able to say to myself, this is the bit of land that my ancestors stole. Now, and I now know, unlike 20 years ago when I did that other research, I now know what is likely to have happened here. I now know the full horror of the way this country was colonised. So with those two things in mind, the family story on one hand, which leaves out the Aboriginal people, and my now knowledge of what happened to the Aboriginal people, let me just see what happens. It was an exploratory thing. I didn't really know what I was intending, and it certainly wasn't a book.
I love the way the landscape is so much part of the book too, and the speculation, which is quite correct, I'm sure. When you see a great plain, you can see there would be no escape if Aboriginal people. It looks beautiful. It's fertile land. Clearly, the white colonists want it, and there's nowhere to go. Whereas other parts of the landscape that you were in, there were hills that they could hide, and there could be some sort of reasonable opposition set up and escape.
That's right. The landscape is, once you factor in the Aboriginal history of our country as well as the white history, you look at the landscape quite differently. And as you say, up at Gunnedah, which is an incredibly flat part of the world, I looked out and I suddenly, for the first time, that phrase, horses gave the settlers an advantage. I'd read that phrase in dozens of history books, but standing there on that incredibly flat and fairly treeless plain, I understood the physical reality of that for the first time. And that happened to me in many places. Standing on the land unexpectedly made me see things and feel things that I hadn't expected. It's a kind of knowing, being on land, particularly if you know a little bit about what's gone on there, being actually on the place with your feet on the soil is a very, very powerful experience.
And you also interrogate the language, like right from the start, with taking up land as opposed to taking land. And all the way through, we see this kind of weasel words or this way of describing things like accommodation creek, implying that there was some sort of agreement made between Aboriginal people and white people, which clearly did not happen. The one that really intrigued me, though, with the landscape was the one called Gin's Leap. Can you tell that story?
Yes, Gin's Leap, and I beg forgiveness for people who find that word offensive, as I do, but that's what the place is called. It's a huge rock, a little bit like Uluru, actually. There I am using the old white word for Uluru in the same way that Gin's Leap is the white name imposed on that. It's a huge sheer cliff face, and the story that the signage tells you is that it's a kind of Romeo and Juliet story. A young Aboriginal woman and young Aboriginal man were forbidden to marry by the tribal rules. So rather than deny their love for each other, they went up there and jumped off. Now, when I read that, I thought, apart from thinking it should not be called Gin's Leap in this day and age, somebody needs to get onto the naming government organisation and get them to change it. But I also thought, I wonder if that's real. I wonder if that's true. And I thought the fact that it's called Gin's Leap suggests to me that it was only a woman who leapt. And it also, gin is a very offensive word that used to be used quite a matter of factly about Aboriginal women. And it always had a sexualised vibe, because the only reason settlers were interested in Aboriginal women, of course, was for sex. So my thinking is, and there are local stories that would confirm this, that in fact what happened is that a white person wanted sex from an Aboriginal woman, and rather than succumb to his lust, she herself jumped off the cliff, or else she refused and he pushed her. Now, all those stories, nothing is provable after so long. So all those stories kind of hang in the air. They're all possibilities. But what interested me is, once you go there with a questioning frame of mind, once you start looking at the words and questioning them, suddenly you realise that there are many more ways of looking at this than the standard. There's only ever one side of the story. And by unpicking the actual language, we can perhaps at least fracture the neat surface that we have made over events in order to hide them.
And in the case of your own ancestors, you were kind of hoping that John Martin Davis may have just owned a pub and been a sort of jolly, friendly pub owner and possibly nice to the local Aboriginal people, but you found out that he was a squatter.
That's right. All my life I've heard stories about John Martin Davis, and the bit of it that I remembered was John Martin Davis went to Currabubula, little tiny town near Tamworth, and started the hotel, which is still there. That was how the family story put it. Now, there was actually a bit more to the family story, but I had never quite taken that in. So I'd always congratulated myself for being descended not from one of the squatters, who we know were responsible for most of the worst violence on the frontier. My great-great-grandfather wasn't a squatter; he was only a publican. Well, just before I went on this trip in 2023, I did a bit more research, and I discovered, to my absolute horror, that in fact he was a publican, but he was also a squatter. He had 25 square miles in the area around his pub, which was a grazing licence. What horrified me was not that was partly that was the case, and I had to accept that change in my self-image. I couldn't let myself off the hook. But what had horrified me even more is that I had forgotten the bit of the family story that would have told me that fact if I had been listening. And again, it's like taking the language apart. You have to, question everything. And there's another bit of the family story that says, when Martin Davis went up there, no woman was ever left in the hut alone without a gun. Now, nothing is said about what happened with the gun, but suddenly we have threat, we have a gun, we have the presence of the Aboriginal people, and we have the possibility that he was defending much more than a pub, which probably wouldn't have been attacked. I had to confront my own complicity, in a way, in the fact that I had simply not heard that bit of the story.
That's what the whole book brings, is that, it's called Unsettled, and it's the unease and the unsettledness of one race removing another, quietly, not talking about it, changing the language, but basically this great sin that was done in the past. How did you feel at the end of the journey?
At the end of the journey, I felt a sense of disappointment, because I hadn't sort of arrived anywhere, in a way. Nothing particularly had been resolved. I had lots of thoughts and perceptions and lots of feelings, lots of deep feelings. But I felt as if the journey was unfinished. But the journey happened to end at a place called Guyra, which is in northern New South Wales, and it's not that terribly far from the site of the Mile Creek Massacre Memorial, which I had read about and never been to. Now, my family had nothing to do with the Mile Creek Massacre, but I just decided, just on a whim, as I had done this whole journey, to go there and just see what it was. Well, the Mile Creek Massacre was one of the worst. Well, it probably wasn't one of the worst massacres, but it was one of the few that was heavily recorded, because there was a court case about it, so the facts are well known. So I went to so about 40 defenceless Aboriginal people, mostly women and children, were killed in cold blood, premeditatedly, over a whole day by a group of white stockmen. So I went there, and it's an incredibly moving place, and you feel very humble, very ashamed, full of sorrow, all those feelings. But I also learned that the people who had put that memorial together were descendants of the perpetrators and descendants of the survivors. And they had come together in the nearby little town over somebody's kitchen table and decided to kind of sort it out. They decided to talk it through and acknowledge what had happened. So the white people had to put aside their probably defensiveness and guilt and all those uncomfortable feelings that we non-Indigenous Australians have. And the Aboriginal people had to put aside the feelings of hurt and, I imagine, anger. So they did. They came together. They talked it through. Can you imagine how difficult those conversations must have been?
I would
And
love to
came
be
up
the
with
fly on the
this.
wall.
Oh, absolutely. Now, there's a novel. And so they came up with this incredible memorial. And what that told me, it did finish the journey. It said, look, what this says is this is the way forward. Acknowledgement, heartfelt acknowledgement, true understanding, and then coming together to talk about it. This has been done at Mile Creek. It can be done elsewhere. We just have to have the will to do it.
And at the end of this book, Unsettled, do you feel that we can get there? You talk at one stage about war memorials, which is the classic thing of the whole country is covered in war memorials, but really it's only these little creek names and oddly named bits of landscape that give us a clue as to what really happened. Do you think we can come to some kind of a combination that will allow everybody to feel okay? Because, the problem is we can't go back to all the places we came from.
No, that's right. Willy-nilly, we are all here together sharing this place. And I think that's the thing. We are sharing it. And Aboriginal people have different ways of dealing with it. But, the fact that they are prepared to offer us welcomes to their country is astonishing. I mean, we walked in, we non-Indigenous, all those years ago, like just walking into somebody's house without knocking, and we've helped ourselves to the contents of the fridge and turfed the people who are living there out into the back lane. But in spite of that, the residents are saying, well, okay, let's accept that. Welcome to my country. It's an extraordinary act of generosity. Look, I think if you'd asked me a few weeks ago, I would have felt much more hopeful. But the backlash against Welcome to Country, particularly, is a symbol, I think, of a real backward step. But on the other hand, I heard Thomas Mayo speak recently. He was very heavily involved with the referendum. And he said, look, we Aboriginal people have been used to getting knockbacks for 250 years, but we continue to make progress. We continue to stay strong. And actually watching Elder Mark Brown deliver that welcome at the Anzac Day thing in Melbourne, where he was booed, what a disgrace. Seeing the look on his face, what it was he was not surprised. This has been happening to him and his people, for 2 centuries. But he kept on going with great strength and dignity. So I think there is hope, but I think we non-Indigenous people have to come much further. We have to come more than halfway to meet that generous act.
Wise words from a very intelligent, experienced and beautiful writer, Kate Grenville. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back with a full episode soon. Happy reading.